Hey everyone again. It's Jack from Datassential. I'm joined this week by Dana, who is a new member of our team. She's going to be here with me talking about some restaurant opening information, and more importantly about the dynamics and the future of food delivery. So Dana joins us quite recently, but has a ton of expertise in this space, having held senior strategy positions at Grubhub and other services that you may know. And with that, we'll actually go ahead and get started gently as people continue to file in. So let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen out. And let's see. Okay. Is that popping up okay? Can you see the big radar dish?
Yep.
All right. So thanks again, everyone. And just as a reminder, these sessions really are just as much about you as they are about us. So please jump in, select all panelists and attendees. When using that chat function, you'll be able to share things with lots and lots of other people throughout the food industry. A lot of food manufacturers, food service manufacturers, restaurants, retailers, and everybody in between. So let's share our experiences, and together, hopefully we can learn and continue making things better for the industry. Just as a friendly reminder, there is still a ton of content available to you that continues to get updated on Datassential's coronavirus webpage. So there are new reports that are always being posted. I've lost track as to how many reports are there now. They're all completely free for the industry. We're trying to do whatever we can to get you the information you need to speed through this recovery as best we can. You'll also find links there where you can see updates to our 2021 projections, which have been published with IFMA and are part of the IFMA scope service that IFMA offers. And we're basically predicting something like a 7+% bounce back in 2021. And you can get all the details by individual segment of the industry to what the forecast looks like. But go to datassential.com/coronavirus and you'll find tons of content there. Again, it's completely free to you. We only ask that you share it broadly so that more can benefit from the information. And I guess maybe here's another question for chat that I was sort of thinking. I didn't even know what the appropriate picture would be here. You know, I think look, COVID is straight up bad. I mean, it's hard to say that there's a net positive that results from it, but there is a sort of like, is the glass half empty? Is it half full? Is it something in between? And I sort of feel like there are certainly some silver linings that have come out from this. So, you know, almost in your personal lives, and this is to everybody, are there any positives that have emerged from COVID, whether it's for you personally or for the industry? I can speak for myself. I mean, I've gotten so much of my life back not sitting at airports and, you know, traveling 3 days for a 45-minute meeting. That has been extraordinarily meaningful and positive for me. So I would say that is clearly, you know, for me, a silver lining. But flood that chat channel. Let's see if we can generate some positivity. What are some other things that you see as positive outcomes? We know most of it's been really terrible, but are there some positive things that you could share, and maybe we just feel a little bit better about all this? Okay, so let's get started with some of the key figures. We've been tracking from the very, very early days whether people are very concerned about coronavirus. And you could see where we were back in early March, and we hit a peak in April. It dropped down, and then all of a sudden in June, it started ramping up again as the cumulative death counts continue to go up and up and up, and the stories were oriented around how things are just not being contained yet. And now we've seen recently, just as of yesterday, a little bit of a decline. We're at 53% being very concerned about coronavirus. So certainly not a low point for us, but it looks like that upward spike that we saw between June and August is starting to pull back a little bit. And if you have theories as to what may be driving this, we're all ears. The other key stat that we've been tracking for a while, as you all know, is how do you feel about eating out? Are you definitely avoiding eating out? And you can see we're back in that mid 40s-ish range, which is sort of where the numbers had settled to for a while, right? We hit a really big peak. We're in early April. This is when there was talk about there being potentially, 2 to 2.5 million eventual fatalities from COVID in the US alone, which was very, very scary to hear. That number spiked like crazy. We feel much more comfortable about things now. We saw the number start to peak again coming through the end of June. We hit a number in the low 50s, and now we're back in that mid 40s range. So it seems like we're back to a little bit more comfortable of a level. And this really is going to be, to some extent, location dependent. I mean, I can tell you that here in Williamson County, Tennessee, people seem pretty willing to be out and about in restaurants right now, but in some other parts of the country, clearly not so much. Okay, so I'd like to spend a little time, and Dana, jump in with any local observations or any color that you might want to add. Just what's happening with restaurant closures and reopening. So this is something we've been looking at for a while now. And here's the short of it. As of today, about 8% of the restaurants that were open pre-COVID, right before COVID hit, are now closed. This is down from the 11.5% that were closed in May. So we've had net number of reopenings, and the number works out to about 25,000 restaurants have successfully reopened since May. 25,000 have successfully reopened. This means not only have they reopened, but they have actually stayed open. The thing to note here is that those 25,000 restaurants that have reopened and stayed open, that's actually a lower number than we saw in July, because some of those that had opened between May and July have actually since closed when they realized they just didn't have enough business to make it work. And this time when they closed, they've closed probably permanently. So yes, about 25,000 have successfully reopened, but this is actually a lower number than we saw in July. And to give you a view of this, we could see what the world looked like in May. You had about 11.5% of restaurants were closed as of early May. 8% were temporarily closed. 3.3% were permanently closed. And then if we move to sometime in July, the net closure rate was 7.6%, where you saw the temporary closures went way down because restaurants started reopening. But the permanent closure number started going up because once you close. And some of those temporary closures became permanent closures. And the question is, where are we as of just about a week ago? And here's that number. Our net closure number is at 8%. So we actually have more closures now than we do as of July. The temporary closures have declined yet a little bit more, and the permanent closures have increased a little bit. So from a whether things are open or closed perspective, you could actually argue that things look better in July than they do today. But the dynamic really is, hey, things were terrible for a while. We couldn't even open up. And then some places finally started opening up. And then it's like, oh, wait, we actually don't have the level of business sufficient to keep us open. I would argue that probably, in some cases, a lot of those closures can happen in areas that are just decimated where there's no people traffic anymore. In other cases, it could be restaurants that for whatever reason were not able to adapt. They weren't able to leverage delivery the way they might have wanted to. They weren't able to make other changes, and that's what's sort of done it. So you could think of it as, we had a lot of reopening from May to July, but on net, it's been flat or actually a little bit down from July until today. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the percentage of restaurants that are actually closed and how this has sort of moved over time, here it is. And here it is by type of restaurant as well. Generally speaking, from July up until September, so you see every couple of weeks, we post new numbers. You could see that the total percentage of restaurants closed tends to inch upwards, right? So I think what this essentially means is the restaurants that were very likely or able to reopen have basically reopened. And then the decay that's associated with just there not being enough business or something else that's challenging in those businesses has caused some of those to close up again, and likely permanently in those cases. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily good news, but I wouldn't really say it's necessarily bad news either. I think this is just generally expected given what we know about current business conditions, that particularly independent restaurants are having a tough time, but they've actually been more likely to say, you know what, I'm going to try to tough it through and stay open if I can, even if it means very depressed levels of business to get there. So let's take a look at what's actually closed. This is the percentage of restaurants that are actually closed today by the type of menu or cuisine. And it really just sort of makes intuitive sense, right? I mean, Dana, I'm saying it's, buffet restaurants, that's exactly what you'd expect to have been more likely to have closed up. Soup and salad places where there's a lot of self-service, there's like a salad bar or a soup bar, makes sense. French restaurants, and we've seen this too. I actually don't know precisely what is causing this, but we've seen throughout the data that French restaurants, it's not a ton of them, but where there are French restaurants, they tend to be the ones that are really likely to have not opened back up.
Well, I think we'll get to it in a minute, but it may also be that their locations tend to be in some of these more urban areas.
Well, that's true. I guess if I think about like the rural truck stop, I don't typically see a French restaurant over there. So that would certainly explain it. Gastropubs, perhaps where there's a greater emphasis on food coming out a certain way, or the fact that it's a pub and it's largely about sitting there and drinking too. Perhaps Moroccan, which might in some cases be more of a event-driven meal. I mean, it all seems to make sense. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you see the stuff that's really resilient. Wings places, burger places, bagel places, Thai restaurants, for some reason. I guess they just refuse to go, or maybe Thai is just comforting.
So what I see in that is those are all foods that we generally all agree deliver really well.
That's true. That's a great point. You're going to have to convince me on the burger thing, though. But I think you have some thoughts there.
Tricky. The burger thing is tricky. That I have to agree with.
But I think you'll talk about a little bit about how you've had experiences where burgers actually can be done great if packaged a certain way.
Yeah.
So this is the breakout that you can see by state of permanent closures versus temporary closures. The red stem is the percentage of places that are permanently closed, and the yellow stem, or I guess goldenrod, is that a color? Stem are the temporary closures. And what you're seeing now is there's a lot of stability in the permanent closures across states. There's not that much variance. In the early days of the pandemic, it varied quite a bit more. But what you're really seeing is a much greater contraction in the temporary closures versus the early days of the pandemic. You see a lot more variability in temporary closures by state, but it's not as crazy as it was in the early days. In the early days, it was like between 2% and 24%. Now it's between about 1% and 10%, depending on the state. And DC, I guess it's not a state technically, remains the most closed place in the country. And it's actually funny, we're thinking about actually taking a trip to DC. We said, oh, we want to go there and maybe like see some museums while it's not very crowded or something. Like none of them are open. I think there's something like 19 museums in the Smithsonian system, and 2 of them are open at this point. And as you see here, a lot of the restaurants have decided not to be open right now either. But DC, Hawaii, and Nevada, all for pretty obvious reasons, right, are among the most closed places. And you gotta tip your hat to Idaho, which is the most open state in the country right now, as far as restaurants go. The other thing, and I think this is probably gonna be intuitive to you, but we have hard data on this, is closures are more likely to happen in urban areas. About almost 10% of restaurants in urban areas are either temporarily or permanently closed. That number dips to about 6%, which is considerably lower in rural areas. We saw this from day one. And I would actually say the effects today are probably not even as strong as we saw early on. In the early days, urban was just sort of shut down, right? And the rural places were much more open. Now, even after reopening has basically occurred en masse, urban places still remain significantly more closed than rural places. And, I think this will probably be a topic for maybe a future webinar, but there's been a whole lot of conversation and also just behavior around this notion of what we call dual migration, which is a trend that we started talking about actually like 2 or 3 years ago. And COVID has just utterly accelerated. And the concept is pretty simple. We've been seeing for a little bit now a mass migration away from tier 1 cities to people moving from like the really, really big cities to sort of tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And we've also seen a migration pattern of people that were typically in the city center, downtown area, moving out to like the perimeter of the city or the suburbs somewhere. It seems like COVID is only going to serve to accelerate that in a very significant way. And you probably hear, on the news, all the stories of people, leaving mass exodus from, California or whatever it might be and going to this other place instead. I think you're going to hear more and more of that, and it's really going to sort of rebalance where the restaurant universe is. And I think you make a very strong argument for how typically you had all the really trendy stuff just downtown, but now as like millennials and other young people move out of the downtown area and move a little bit further away into the perimeters, we should have those really trendy, cool foods there too. So we'll talk about that in the future. This is a picture of the Datassential office. The floor does not look quite as good these days. There's all sorts of cracks and stuff in there. We'll have to get that fixed one day. That's two of Dana and my colleagues in that picture. That's Emily and Max. This last week, actually this week, we officially reopened our office at I think something like 15% maximum capacity. And I think so far, we have 2 floors of the building. I think so far 1 person has come into the office. So we're off to a slow start toward the return, but that's okay. That's sort of the idea. And the question is, what does this actually mean for the area? So here's a Google Earth shot. And you can sort of see our office is this building right here. Did you all know, you see this thing over here? I don't know if you can see my mouse wiggle around. This is that Chicago like bean thing that everyone takes a picture of. Who here knew that it actually had a name? The name was actually Cloudgate, is the official name of that thing. I did not know that until I looked things up in Google Earth. So that's a bit of trivia for you. If someone says, I'm going to Cloudgate, now you know what it is. It is a mirrored bean-shaped structure. I really think the bean is a better name, but so it is. So, I'm gonna say the bean. The bean, yeah, it's the bean, right? Yeah, so here we are, that's our building, and we're in the 60603 zip code of Chicago. Take a look around in this picture. What do you see? I see a lot of office buildings. I don't see that many places for people to actually live. I see a lot of places where people come in to work. And what I keep hearing is it's really sort of like a ghost town over there right now. And this is, an example of a zip code that has what we call a very high variable population. It means that the percentage of people there at any given time are much more likely to be workers just there during the day than they are to be residents that actually live there. And when you suck out a lot of that daytime population, those people coming in for work, there's really not much to support the local restaurants in the area. So if we expand this a little bit, you can see there's something else that happens too. When you have a lot of people coming in and you have a lot of people that are there, but none of them really live there, you actually create a lot of restaurants, especially for lunchtime business. And you could actually take a look. If you looked in our system and looked at, let's say, the restaurants in that Chicago Loop area, which is where our office is, versus restaurants in the River North area, just north of the river, the style of restaurant is totally different. In the Loop, it's mostly like fast casual and QSR type places where you can grab like a quick lunch. And then most of those restaurants close pretty early in the day. You go into River North and it becomes a lot of dinner places and casual dining and places that serve alcohol. and whatnot. But we actually have a measure in our Firefly system that we call density. Density is the number of restaurants per 1,000 people that live in the area. The average for the country, the US national average for density, is like 2. I think it's actually like 2.1. In the 60603 zip code, the density is 96. It's 50 times more dense if you think about that ratio of restaurants to people that actually live there than you see nationally. And what you find is that density can become a predictor of whether places are likely to be open or closed right now. And you see it right here, right? So in ultra high density zip codes, like the one I just showed you where we have our office, you have a much higher rate of restaurant closures than you do in low density zip codes. It just sort of makes sense. This is an even greater effect than that urban, suburban, rural breakout we looked at just a few moments ago. Density is a major predictor. And I know, Dana, you're going to share, I think, some thoughts later on about how density is a way that delivery services will typically look at a market. I don't know if you want to maybe provide a little preview of that thought.
Yeah. So especially if a delivery service is delivering for multiple restaurants, the density of both restaurants and people is sort of how you make that last mile logistics system work. So delivery businesses almost universally started in these ultra dense areas because the economics have a chance, right? In suburban and rural areas, it's taken a lot of demand in order to make those business models even remotely viable in those areas. So this is where delivery all begins.
In ultra dense, yep.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a piece of trivia for everyone. There's over 40,000 zip codes in the US. Now some of these are zip codes the way you would think about them, which is a big area of land that has, houses and stores and restaurants and stuff of them. Some of them are like funky ones that are like allocated to like a special purpose, like it's a military zip code or used for something that's not representative of just a big chunk of land. But you can basically take those 41,000 zip codes and examine what sits on that piece of land. And this is actually what we did. We did this a while ago in our Firefly tool. And we basically said, let's look at every zip code across the country. Let's look at the people that live in those zip codes. Let's look at the restaurants that are there, what type they are, what type of food they serve. Are they high end? Are they, are they fast food? Let's look at the hotels. Are there 5-star hotels? Let's look at the types of businesses that are there. Is it, more travel and entertainment oriented? Is it manufacturing? And based on that, we came up with 28 distinct food communities, different sort of ways to classify an individual zip code based on what just like the zeitgeist or feeling of food is, right? Are you a place that has, really high-end dining options that's very vibrant and lots of people going out and having like business meals and stuff? Or are you more of like a, off of the turnpike type of place where you just have a cluster of fast food restaurants and it's really meant more for the passing truck driver, let's say? They came up with 28 different classifications and assigned one of those classifications to every zip code in the country. And the question is, if you think about these 28 food communities, as we call them, do you see differences in whether the restaurants that in those communities are open or closed? I guess I probably gave away the answer because I wouldn't be showing this to you if the answer was it didn't make a difference. It does make a difference. And here are those 28 food communities. They all have fun names attached to them. They're usually pretty self-descriptive, but I'll actually highlight a couple of examples to just sort of take you through what some of these communities are. So there's a pretty varied range. In some communities, maybe 5% of restaurants are closed. In some, nearly 20% are closed. Let's look at the high side of this. There's a food community that we call dynamic upscale dining. There's one that we call hip storefronts and hotspots. I will focus on the dynamic upscale dining one real quick. I think there's several hundred zip codes that fit this description. And one of them is the zip code that defines the Las Vegas Strip. It's been a while since I lived in Vegas. I think this might be 89102, but I could be wrong if someone wants to fact check that. Is fact check just like a standard like term or phrase used in everyday parlance? Now I think it is. So if anyone wants to fact check if 89102 is actually the Las Vegas Strip, please do. But that is a zip code that we've identified or as dynamic upscale dining, the Las Vegas Strip, right? Densely packed urban areas dominated by independents offering both casual and fine dining options. Trend-forward restaurants are common in these areas, as are higher-end global cuisines. And the interesting thing is you also see that in these areas, in dynamic upscale dining, in these communities, you're more likely to find more adventurous foods, more things that are early stage, things that are sort of that first stage of the menu adoption cycle. But a lot of these places are closed right now. Versus, let's say you look at the other end of the spectrum, some of those food communities that are more likely to be, open or not closed, neighborhood dining plazas, neighborhood diners, scattered quick bites, country mom and pops, et cetera. And then you have that last one where only 5.7% of restaurants in those communities are closed, and that would be the fast food rural hubs. And it would be something like this, right? It's that thing off the freeway or off the road where you have maybe a cluster of national chain restaurants, oftentimes that are more in that quick service space, right? Really the exact opposite of dynamic upscale dining. And these areas have been much more resilient. So I wanted to go back to something we've said sort of at the outset of COVID, which is location really is sort of everything in a lot of regards. And there's a lot of ways to think about locations. The food community is one of those ways. But in general, the more dense you are, the more urban you are, the more oriented you are toward an area that has high variable population or that's just smack dab in the center of a city, those are the places that are most challenged because there's just not enough people to go around. So there is a flip side of this, which is there's some good news too, which is restaurants are actually opening. They are. So we've been talking about restaurant closures and reopenings, but there's also brand new restaurant openings, places that literally opened up for the very first time during COVID. You may have noticed some in your area, and I would invite you to maybe just post in chat, like, have you actually seen a brand new restaurant around you? I think, Dana, did you say there's a couple around you too?
Yeah, there are two within 2 blocks of my apartment.
What are they, anything special about them or?
So one is that Northern Chinese cuisine. And so it's a little bit more of a, I would say it's a casual, it's not quite, it's fast, but it's not quite. Yep. It's not quite grab and go. And the other is a high-end organic Thai restaurant, which, given what we saw with Thai restaurants, makes me feel pretty good about their potential.
They're unlikely to ever close down again. Is
the last, yeah. And I tried it and it was delicious, so I'm happy.
Yeah. So restaurants are opening brand new for the first time, but they're not in the same proportion as we've historically seen them. So the gray bars over here is what the total universe of restaurants looks like, basically as of today. And the minty green color, that's what these brand new restaurants that have just opened up during COVID over the last couple of months, brand new first time openings, that's what they look like. And you basically have more fast casual places opening, and you have fewer casual dining and virtually zero fine dining restaurants opening. And I think a lot of what you're seeing, if you think about the timing, right? COVID hits in March, and we're talking about openings over the last 6 months or so. I don't think there have been a lot of restaurants that opened that were conceived during COVID and then opened during COVID. These are probably mostly places that were conceived pre-COVID, and then the owners had to make a decision about, do we continue with the opening or not? So I don't think that spike you see in fast casual is necessarily that, hey, people said, let's open a bunch of fast casual restaurants. It's probably more that if you were going to open a fast casual place, you were less likely to say, you know what, let's not open up right now, than if you were to planning to open a fine dining restaurant or a casual dining restaurant, let's say. If you're planning to open a fine dining place, you probably have just said, I'm going to put the kibosh on this until we get things squared away. So this is more, I think, a representation of what people are not, hitting snooze on, if you will. And I would want to just say that even though brand new restaurants are opening, they're not opening super fast. They're opening at about 25% of their normal opening pace, which again goes back to that thought that it's mostly restaurants that were probably going to open anyways. And then the owners decided, okay, let's go ahead and still do it versus let's pause for a little bit. So I think what'll probably happen is you'll see some of those closures that we talked about early on continue to play out for a bit. Some of those units will then become available. And I think you'll see still a very slow pace of opening for the next couple to few months. And then some sort of an explosion will happen as there will be sort of a mass movement to getting these things going again, and the restaurants that you had planned getting going again. And on top of that pent up demand, there are going to be places that are new ideas that have been birthed during COVID, where people said, you know what, I'm conceiving of something cool and new. There's a whole lot of restaurant space that's available to me right now. Those kitchens are already there, and I can just adapt them. Might be an easier, quick turnaround to get into something new, but I don't think that's going to happen in the next couple of months. You're probably looking maybe end of the year, first quarter, second quarter of next year before some of that explosion happens. So here's a question for you all, and I think we might have a poll. So there are 670,000, actually there's not a poll. This is just you can do this in chat if you want to make a guess. There's about almost 700,000 restaurants in America today. What percentage would you guess offer delivery, whether it's them delivering directly or using a third-party marketplace to deliver? What percentage of all restaurants in America today, type your guesses in a chat, we'll see who gets closest. What percentage of all restaurants today,
range.
There's a range, if you took the average of the range, would we be getting to a pretty good number?
I mean, you guys are coming in fast and furious, but I see everything from 10% to 90%.
I think that is the exact definition of a wide range. I don't know if we can go much wider than that. So what percentage, if you were to ask me, and I didn't already know the answer to this, I would have guessed probably like 35, 40%. That's sort of, as a consumer, that's what it feels like to me when I drive up and down the street. I see all the restaurants, then I open my app and I see what's there. But here's the actual number. So this is what restaurants offer that are open today. 95% off for takeout. 70% right now of all those units offer delivery in some way, which to me was quite surprising. I think, Dana, you weren't quite as surprised given your background, but
I was still, I'm more surprised because I know what these numbers used to be. And I started working in delivery in 2009, and I couldn't have imagined this world. This world is incredible.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I mean, like 2/3 of places that you'd be interested in eating in are accessible to you in some way. But I think a lot of it too is like your perception as a consumer. Like, does that place deliver? Does it not? Sometimes it's on the app, sometimes it's not. I guess those apps, do they sort of like factor in traffic and stuff to figure out what to actually display the consumer? Because I swear sometimes certain restaurants are there and sometimes they're not, even though that restaurant's still open. There's other stuff going in there. So 2/3 I think is a huge number, and you can see the other numbers too, right? 13% offer a drive-through, 1 in 5 are doing something curbside, and about 30% are open for dine-in, or will advertise that they're open for dine-in in some way. And these are the restaurants that offer delivery. So isn't that interesting that the most closed state, or I don't know, area, what do you call DC? Part of the country? The most closed part of the country is the part of the country that is most likely to offer delivery right now. There seems to be a relationship there. Arizona's there, and then Nevada is right there too. Where Nevada was one of the parts of the country that was most closed as well, and delivery has played a much stronger role. And then you look at something like, I guess I don't know what to make of Hawaii. Let's say it's sort of here where my mouse is. Like that was one of the super closed areas, but they have not really switched to delivery. Is it possible that some services just don't operate in Hawaii yet, or is it so spread out that it's like driving all the way to the other end of the island is not viable? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
But you can see there is certainly a relationship that if restaurants are closing, that probably is an indication that foot traffic is challenged, but people still want food, so they're counting on delivery to get it to them instead.
I would think that in Hawaii, it's sort of a blend of that and some of what you're seeing in Las Vegas around a very hospitality oriented, tourism oriented area where it might not make, it might be better to stay closed than to offer delivery if there's nobody there to receive it.
Oh, that's actually a good point, right? Yeah. So like in New York, people do still live there, but they live maybe a little bit further away from work. In Hawaii, like people are just gone during the day and at night. Yeah. So that
Yeah. Yeah, and some of these resorts are relatively hard to reach.
Yep.
So
here's that same data, but we've plotted on two axes now, the percentage of stores or restaurants in each state that offer delivery, as well as the total number of units. I love California, but I hate it for charting purposes because it always screws up the chart because it's so far away from everything else in terms of size that it makes it hard to see everything else that ends up getting squished together over here. But this is basically the landscape. So you could probably pick out where your state is and see how you're doing compared to the rest of the country. Here's that same information, but instead of looking at by state, we're looking at it by the type of restaurant. So what type of food does it serve? And we've labeled a few of these just for clarity. So each dot represents a different cuisine type. And we added like a little label to some of these so you could actually see what they are. Otherwise, you'd have a bunch of like words overlapping each other. So you have pizza over there with a ton of units and obviously, you know, extremely likely to offer delivery. But look over here, and burgers over here. But look at over here. Indian is actually the food that is most likely to be offered via delivery. I actually think Indian food delivers great.
it does.
And I don't know why, but like no matter what, it comes piping hot, even if it has to travel 20 minutes. I don't know what the special like chemical, you know, composition secret of Indian food is that causes it to just travel so damn well, but it really does. That said, I would not have expected it to be number one. I would have thought pizza would have been number one, but Indian is it. And you can see some of the other ones too. Mexican sandwich, coffee and tea, all sort of very, very common in terms of how many units there are, but only about middle of the pack in terms of whether they're delivering or not. Bars and pubs, lots of bars and pubs that do serve food. So these are places that actually serve food, not just alcohol. But if you're primarily like a bar or pub, or that's how you market yourself, or that's what you're known as, even if you have a food menu, you're much less likely to offer delivery. And then donut places too. So one thing to note is we actually classify Dunkin' as coffee bakery, given their extraordinary beverage focus and a lot of things they've done with their menu over the years. So these are other donut shops, and I don't know why donut places don't deliver. Is it that the ticket is not high enough to justify it? I just don't know. What does a dozen donuts go for these days?
There's also just not a ton of breakfast delivery. Like breakfast delivery is not the meal part that's winning the day.
Yeah, I guess also, I mean, donuts I assume are typically for the office, right? And there's no place to live. Does anyone get like a dozen donuts for their home? Maybe. I don't know. I may have to try to do that. And then if you look
have
at
it when it's fresh, not worth it if it's not fresh, right?
yes, oh yeah, and here you go. I mean, if you want to look at this by cuisine with the numbers for each of the cuisine types, this is the same data, but just looking at percentage of restaurants from those cuisine types that deliver. Here's what those numbers are, and I think a lot of this does typically make sense, right? That I think there are a few things that I find a little bit surprising. Like I'm surprised that as many ice cream places deliver. I know most of the ones around me actually do over here, but I've also ordered, you know, stuff that's come and it's been like melted too, so you never quite know. So here's a question for you. I'm going to do this as a poll. Who do you think is more likely to offer deliveries? So let's this is an easy one. As of today, which type of restaurant is more likely to offer delivery today? So Dana, as these things tally up, and you'll probably color the answers a little bit, do you want to talk to us about sort of how, I don't know, delivery services got started and who their initial market was? Was it smaller independents? Was it big chains?
Yeah. So I started at part of Grubhub that was called Seamless Web in 2009, and we were, though we worked with some local chains, we really were a service provider to independent restaurants, and that was because at that time, other than the big pizza chains, no chains were doing self-delivery, and we didn't have drivers. We didn't have anyone couriering food. And it was actually kind of confusing at times because diners would think that we were the ones touching the food and we weren't. So we were just a marketplace and all the restaurants were doing their own delivery. So when we were talking about what percent of restaurants deliver, the limiting factor for me at that point in my work life was how many restaurants wanted to offer delivery, because I was signing them up for a marketplace and like a shopping mall. So it was always an independence ball of wax at that point in time.
So almost everyone voted before you got started, so you did not color the responses. So these are legitimate, and here's how everyone voted. So we voted primarily chain over independent, which would have been a shift from what you said the delivery marketplaces focused on initially. And we have some very smart people that are part of this webinar, because it is chains that are more likely to deliver today. Yep. And more so than that, as the size of the chain grows, so does your likelihood to deliver as well, which is quite dramatic. And that's frankly why I think 70% of places deliver this these days, because chains have completely jumped onto the thing. It's totally different. I remember the early days of restaurant delivery too. It really was all independent restaurants. And then I think you saw a couple of the platforms focus a little bit more on chains, and it drove a lot of this forward. So, so good guessing, everybody. You also see that delivery is, I guess there are two things that are surprising here. One is that just the numbers are so high overall. But you see that delivery is more common in urban areas than in suburban or rural areas. But the second thing, which I think is even more important, and Dana, if you want to talk to this, is the numbers are not small in suburbs or even in rural areas. I mean, this is almost the opposite of what you were saying with density earlier on, right? And how things have evolved.
Yeah. So I think so density only matters because density is a proxy for demand. It's for how many people might be placing orders. And so what COVID, I think, has done, and what was already pretty much happening, there was already sort of, the trend line was already ticking up, is it's made places that used to be potentially low demand suddenly be high demand. And it turns out you can actually do this. You can pull off the magic of bringing hot food to someone's door in a place that's less dense if there really is enough demand in the market for it.
Yeah. So let's take a look at one thing real quick, and then we'll jump into some of the real delivery specifics. We measure in scores every single month all the new items and LTOs that launch at chain restaurants, along with what consumers think of those. And this is the number of menu launches we've seen so far this year. You can see, we got to COVID and things fell off a cliff, and chains were not debuting nearly as many items as they did in the months of April and May. But from June through August, we're seeing a return, and we're getting actually not that far away from what historic levels are. So I'd like to see this number get back above, let's say 300 or 320. But we started that recovery pretty well, and we've grown like 50 or 60% or 70% just from the month of May already. So new menu activity has returned. And what we do with scores is, because of COVID, we added a new question that we're going to be keeping in the long run, a new metric, which is, how would you like to have that item? Do you want to have it for delivery? Do you want to have it for to go? Do you want to have it for dine-in? And since July, we've had, since March, we've had over 1,000 items that have debuted on restaurant menus at chains. And this is the appeal of those items within each category of item, whether it's a burger or a pizza or soup or you name it, and whether people want to have it for delivery, to go, or dine-in. And I would call out that there are some categories of food where the blue dot, which is to go, is higher than the green dot, and that makes sense. It's things like breakfast sandwiches and breakfast pastries and non-alcoholic beverages. The average scores for those for to-go appeal are higher. Then you have some where the green dot is higher, right? This would be, people are more likely to say, I'd rather have this for dine-in, whether it's a pasta dish or seafood or an adult beverage of some sort. But there's only one dot where the pink dot is higher than either the blue or the green, and that's pizza, as you would imagine. For every other category of the menu, appeal for delivery is lower than appeal to have it either in store or taken to go. And as delivery continues to grow and continues to be important, and that 70% number either stays strong or maybe pulls back a little bit, maybe it advances, it's a big chunk, and it's a big chunk of business today. I think we as an industry need to think about how we get this pink line higher than where it is. We've solved it for pizza long ago, but we still have a pretty big gap between the pink and the blue and the green, and this should be on all of our minds. So Dana, can you do like a 10-second version of your delivery background, your delivery cred, and then we'll jump into some of the insights?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I started at Seamless Web in 2009. I was in a strategy role, did a lot of work with that organization, and then we merged with Grubhub in 2013 and became a public company in 2014. And I was in various different roles at that company for a long period of time. I worked directly with restaurants in some of my roles. And I also worked in product and technology and other sort of more behind the scenes functions. So it was an awesome experience. I left there in 2016. I spent the last couple of years before Datassential working also in restaurant technology on the reservation side, which has similar dynamics to the delivery marketplaces. And I'm thrilled to be a part of Datassential now.
And we're thrilled to have you. So we're going to tap your brain on some of the delivery stuff, but I wanted to start with just a quick poll. And this is a really easy one. There is no right answer or wrong answer. This is just personal experience. How many different delivery services have you personally, how many different third-party delivery services for restaurants have you ordered from since the start of COVID? How many different ones? Have you used just one? You know, so there's Uber Eats, Grubhub, DoorDash, etc. Have you used just one service, two services, three services, four more services, or none at all? What would you guess, Dana, is the percentage of people that have used at least one service?
I would suspect it would be very high among this group, especially.
Ooh, well, I don't know. We saw the lunch thing earlier on, and we weren't getting the most interesting lunches in the world either. So
True.
So,
I'm gonna and somebody wants to know if Drizzly counts. I'm gonna say not for this.
And we'll talk about Drizzly.
We're talking about
like
food.
Yeah, food. So we have enough votes. Well, let's take a look. So I'm gonna stop the voting. I'm gonna share this out. So 60% of us have ordered restaurant delivery from a marketplace. Of that 60%, the overwhelming majority uses more than just one service.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what we see with consumers overall. It is sort of a mishmash. You probably have multiple apps. There's that brave 6% that uses four or more, which is not easy to do. Do you think we'll see like a delivery aggregator one day where sort of like
a kayak
for food delivery?
That's always been like something that people talk about, but it just doesn't exist yet. And sort of, I guess, if it hasn't come yet, then why?
I don't know. We'll see. But perhaps. Tell us about what we've seen with delivery during the pandemic.
Yeah. So only a couple of companies in the space are public and have available information. But I think one of the things that we see is that the pandemic has affected every aspect of what would be part of that business. So it's not that delivery is growing because more restaurants are trying to get involved. It's that more restaurants are getting involved, more diners are getting involved. Those diners are placing more and bigger orders. So is it supply pulling demand, or is it demand pulling supply? It's everything. And I think the fact that we see it across multiple companies sort of takes away any like who's winning the delivery wars. It's sort of irrelevant. The pandemic is absolutely bolstering these third-party delivery services, and more likely it's bolstering white label service providers too, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Some of you mentioned in the comments that you like to order direct from restaurants' own websites, and of course we so get that, and supporting restaurants right now has become a big trend as well.
We're saying this is not just a restaurant trend.
Yeah. So, and somebody asked about Drizzly. This is Minibar. Of course, we're delivering alcohol, and we can look, we're also delivering groceries. And Jack, you can keep going, because I think the point is simply everything's getting delivered. All these businesses are showing remarkable results to their constituents and to all of us as consumers. And then there's like every package and the sheer volume of packages that are coming through selling everything else. So whether you think about alcohol or you think about groceries, which have some temperature elements to deal with, or you think about packages, which generally don't have temperature elements, food delivery is still a pretty different thing. You can keep going, Jack.
Yeah. And let's talk about food delivery.
Yeah. So food delivery has, I'm going to go through 6 things and I'll try and be sort of quick about them. But there are 6 things about food delivery that I think are different and sort of worth wrapping your head around. And temperature might be an obvious place to start, but compared to every other kind of delivery that you might get in a short time frame, temperature for food delivery is just far more important. You have less time to work with, just full stop. If you're using a third party, and I see all the comments coming in about hot food hot and cold food cold, if you're using a third party, even if the restaurant does a phenomenal job, the delivery person, who's often an independent contractor, could muck it up by putting 2 packages next to each other. Or the reverse could happen. The restaurant could do a poor job and the delivery service could get blamed. So it's sort of like so many hands in the pot doing something that's really, really, really hard. One of the more interesting solutions to that has been some menu innovation. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So the next piece is packaging. So packaging makes a big difference. It can help you with the temperature problem, but it can also help you make a food that isn't appealing for delivery more appealing. And so Jack mentioned he doesn't like getting burgers delivered. And I mentioned actually one of my favorite delivery meals happens to be a burger from a restaurant called Westville in New York City. And they have made a packaging choice that I think is really interesting. They allow you to check a box to separate your patty from your bun. It doesn't look good on arrival. You have to compose your own sandwich, but the burger travels so well when it's not attached to the bun, and the bun also travels really well when it's not attached to the burger. So I think there are some interesting things that people can do, and diners are more willing than you might think if in that trade-off you focus on food quality. So as operators, we have to think about the cost of the packaging. We have to think about the food quality of the particular menu item. And we also have to think about how it feels to unbox that item. And sometimes in order to make a food more appealing for delivery, you might actually make a different choice than you would have expected on packaging, which I think is really interesting. So the next challenge is the menu. So you wrote a menu for dine-in or for maybe even to go. That's not necessarily a menu that's meant for delivery. And sometimes you have to make some hard choices about what to do about that. And diners sometimes get confused why they can't get a menu item that they're used to seeing for dine-in for delivery. And so it's often important to be transparent about changes you would make. But in a lot of cases, you have to make those changes. I remember one of the first sales calls I went on when I was a brand new employee at a delivery service was to a hot pot restaurant. And they were just sort of like, we can't send boiling water on bikers' backs. It's like completely inappropriate. And we agreed. I think ironically, the COVID American population would probably be okay reheating cold soup and having a cool hot pot night at their house. But if we forget that for a second, what we were able to do with their menu was find all the other things that happened inside that restaurant that were often sides or appetizers. They were often not the stars of the show. And on their delivery menu, we made them the stars of the show. And they were able to still participate in a really important trend in their neighborhood and participate in delivery without having to compromise and send what they would perceive to be batter or
boiling water.
High risk food. So the next piece I want to talk about is density. We've talked about this a lot. You've seen it in some of the numbers, but density was sort of the precursor to getting lots of demand for delivery. And what's been really interesting to see is as demand for delivery has grown in places that are less dense, you're able to actually get companies like Grubhub and Uber and DoorDash to play in these less dense areas. But in the beginning, to get the economics to work, you really just had to have a concentration of diners and restaurants in order for third-party delivery to work. And candidly, in order for first-party delivery to work, you can't have people going, 30-minute round trips back and forth at the same time. And this is another reason why we've seen a lot of consolidation in the delivery marketplaces, because you're really trying to get a lot of orders through the system, because no algorithm can make a great decision if it only has a few decisions to make. The algorithms that send drivers to restaurants and then to diners, they can only work well if there's a lot of data to put through them.
Dana, would you say that density is mostly solved in that maybe it used to be there's some areas where you'd say there's no way we can make delivery work, but now it could sort of work almost anywhere, or are we not quite there yet?
Absolutely. If you look at some of the earliest players in delivery, so I started a company that was headquartered and founded in New York City. One of the other early players was focused on college campuses. That was a function both of density and of presence of broadband internet. If we want to think back far enough, like that was the reason people didn't order online and they preferred to order over the phone, was because of, it was frustrating to get on the internet. So college campuses, density, delivery, usually bad kitchens. New York, density, love for delivery, usually bad kitchens. These were like logical places for these businesses to start. But the reality is the convenience of it is something that has broad consumer appeal. So last mile is like a buzzword across any industry. And for our industry, I think it's really unique because, especially if we're talking about third-party delivery, it's not just about getting food from a restaurant to a diner and then that delivery person going back and getting more food. It's also about timing that into perfect synchronous like glory, so that the food isn't waiting for the driver and the driver's not waiting for the food. Both of those are tremendously costly, both in terms of quality and like real dollars. So wait times in any part of the equation, and often in these parts that are behind the scenes, are actually the really big problems that we have to solve when we're trying to make last mile logistics work for a business. I think it's super interesting because I'm back in New York City and I have ordered Whole Foods through Amazon, and the guy comes with a bike trailer and some big like 45-gallon Glad or Hefty containers and a bungee cord, and that's last mile logistics done by a company that's wonderful at last mile logistics. It has to be so different place to place and environment to environment. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the cool like pie in the sky ideas that people have for last mile. But at the end of the day, we're not doing drones and we're not doing autonomous driving right now. And so a lot of it is this unsexy version of figuring out what's right for a given market. The next challenge that we face is peaks in demand. This one's interesting because it affects both the restaurant and some of the delivery companies as well. And it's something that we're all used to. Restaurants have long utilized a variety of tactics to try and spread out their demand so that they can get more revenue through their either front or back of house. But peaks in food delivery are really interesting because they're often very tight. So we generally get hungry around the same times of day as our fellow Americans. And that results in us hitting the order button very close together. In the old days of food delivery, we used to have physical servers, and those physical servers could only handle a certain number of orders. And if it started raining in New York City at 6:45, there would be a spike in demand like you wouldn't believe, and we would have to worry about server capacity. Like obviously those things aren't, like everything's in the cloud now, and companies aren't worried about that, but it makes you realize just how sharp the peak could be and how surprising it could be, how much it could surprise a kitchen and how much it could surprise a delivery company. and how hard it is for both of those people to staff for that peak, because you have to have people available and people have to work for a longer period of time than just maybe the 1 hour that things are really busy. But in a lot of these businesses, because you don't control when the person clicks the button, you really can't control that peak. And that's a big challenge for doing delivery with.
Would you say that the delivery services are looking for partnership or ideas from their restaurant partners on off-peak promos or something to sort of smooth things out a bit more?
Oh, definitely. I think that there are lots of ideas that help to solve this problem, because I think some of the idea needs to make sense, right? So special menus or pricing at different times of day, I think makes a lot of sense for all the parties. Sending food that you have to reheat, people tried it, just didn't seem to pan out.
Huh, that's interesting. So everyone, I know we're at the hour. We have probably 5 or 6 more minutes. So if you can stick around, please do. There's still good stuff coming up. But if you got to go, we totally understand. Okay, so COVID having changed the relationship, the restaurant-diner relationship. Care to talk about this?
Yeah, so I think some people mentioned also in the chat that they try to order direct from restaurants. There was a flurry of buying gift cards for your favorite restaurants at the beginning, back in March and April. And I think people have also taken a little bit more of an open-minded approach to the technologies and the things that the restaurants that they love are employing. So I think restaurants have been able to utilize more technology with the support of their communities behind them, and they're getting people to do things that previously might have been a bit difficult. And one of those things is white label technologies. So restaurants choosing their own technologies, putting it on their own website, and encouraging diners to go to those websites. These technologies used to simply not be that good, and they're good now. And I think some of them have gotten dramatically better in the last 6 months even. And what we've seen is diners who want to help their local communities be a lot more open to utilizing some of these technologies, which I think is really cool. It also, not only is it cheaper for the restaurant, it has this extra benefit of giving the restaurant more data on who's actually placing the order. So they actually get to understand if it's that loyal diner that they haven't seen on premise for a while is the person who's making these delivery orders.
Is that white label sort of category, is that sort of like the third-party marketplace thing where you have a couple of really big players, or there are tons of different companies white labeling delivery for restaurants?
There are a fair amount, all with sort of their each their own angle, and I would say there isn't a clear winner there as much as in the third-party space there are, a handful of clear winners that have emerged. So it's definitely just a little bit more nascent.
Are any of the third-party marketplaces also offering white label solutions, or are they just marketplaces?
Yeah, they have their versions of it, but I think for a variety of reasons, operators sometimes are opting to make some intentional separation on those fronts.
How about who owns the customer? Is that there a big fight between the marketplace and the brand?
Yep, there are some fights. There are some. I'm sure that some of the larger operators might have made their own negotiations on this point, but I think that we're in a moment of data mattering, and that moment has nothing to do with COVID. It simply was a trend that existed beforehand, and as people have been channel shifting from dining on premise to doing more delivery, operators are going to feel the pain of being further detached from their customers even more than they were already. So I think data continues to be a really controversial topic of conversation among operators and third-party delivery.
So knowing that there are probably some things you can't say, to the extent that you are allowed to, are brands negotiating with marketplaces to get access to customer order data, or how does that?
I don't know, but I would.
Yeah, it seems like that's a big thing, because you could do a lot around predicting what someone's going to want to have next time, and I imagine a lot of that data gets layered in with data from other sources.
Yeah, I think people would I would generally putting my operator hat on, I would want to thread the needle between what's happening on and off premise. And that's really hard to do. As some of these technologies start to be also how you pay the check in store, there are services that now theoretically could see everything a diner does with you, both on and off premise. And wouldn't that be so helpful to understand maybe what they like when they're on premise is different when they like for delivery?
And what's next?
So one of the things that was sort of previously the case in delivery was that if you got into somebody's rotation of delivery, you could really stay there. And so it was an opportunity to earn a slot in somebody's, whether it was an indulgent or maybe a bit of a night where they had a busy schedule and didn't want to cook for themselves. You could earn your slot and you generally could stay there for quite a while. I think it sounds like from some of the comments about people's very boring lunches that opportunity to get into the rotation ought to be there right now for a lot of us. And so restaurants have an opportunity to earn their way in. And then once, diners will try things, you want to make sure that they have that food is particularly well suited to delivery, well packaged for delivery, well delivered. And then you could really have a really nice lasting relationship with that diner that could extend far beyond when hopefully we get a little bit farther into recovery.
And I think you found that historically people would order maybe less adventurous stuff via delivery than if they were going into a restaurant and sitting there, right?
I think it's more about if they found something that they liked at a restaurant, they were more likely to reorder.
Via delivery.
That dish, once they knew it was good, right? So it doesn't mean that people don't try. People try, but it's sort of like you get one at bat, not three.
So that's actually interesting. So is what you get via delivery, let's say, more habitual versus experimentation? Is that a way of thinking about it? You're less likely to try something for the first time via delivery, or you need some validation before you feel safe pressing that button to have it sent to you versus ordering it for the first time at a restaurant?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors. Sometimes one of the factors I think is that sometimes you get to a place where you're actually so hungry by the time you get to your order.
Yeah.
And in those moments, people are more likely to look back at past orders.
Yeah.
So you want to be in those past orders.
Yeah, and that is true. I mean, we look at the data, it's right now, and this goes back to the lunch thing, and that was not the intent of the lunch question earlier on. It just happened to be what everyone replied with. People are sort of bored right now with food. 65% bored of cooking at home, 58% bored of comfort foods, almost 80% saying they're really craving something new. So I think we want to keep that innovation coming. And on what do we have here with the QR code? I feel like these used to be, people used to hate these. Now people sort of like these all of a sudden.
I went to a fine dining restaurant and they dropped a Toast QR code at the end of what was a 3-course lovely meal, and it didn't feel weird. It felt fine. Yeah. It was lovely. Paid the check on the phone and got up and walked right out.
What does that mean for delivery?
So this is back to the point of potentially understanding who's doing delivery and who's in store. When you start to use some of these same systems, then you start to be able to see these things as the same diner. Yep. So this same fine dining restaurant does actually offer delivery. And if I ordered from them for delivery, they would be able to connect the dots on me as a diner who's actually doing both with them.
Yeah, makes sense. Then there's been a lot of talk about ghost kitchens and virtual brands and virtual kitchens and cloud kitchens. I think we wanted to sort of maybe set some tone on what the terminology actually means. I guess, let me know if you think differently, Dana, but in my mind, something like this is a ghost kitchen. It's an incrementally additional physical kitchen that wasn't previously there, that's been established essentially for delivery orders. And that's what we would call a ghost kitchen. Is that sort of the way that the delivery industry thinks of it as well, or?
Yeah, I would say I'm sure there's still some differences of opinions, but I think that is fair.
Yeah, so here DoorDash open up their own commissaries to just deliver out of completely. So that would be a ghost kitchen. Mm-hmm. The thing that's more interesting is this, which I think we would call a virtual brand.
Yep.
Which is what?
So a virtual brand is a delivery only concept that's made out of a kitchen that kitchen could be a ghost kitchen, but at least in this case, this is Brinker delivering it out of their own restaurants that already exist and have different menus from this.
Yeah, so I think this is something that's going to be quite big, right? Because this brand has done exceedingly well, right? Didn't they do something like $150 million?
Yeah, I think
I don't know
their
what the
run
exact
rate is
numbers.
their run rate's $3 million a week, I think.
Yeah, off of virtual brand Just Wings. And you could see, Uber Eats, for instance, they're making a big push behind launching your own virtual restaurant, a brand new brand that's served out of an existing kitchen. So you could be an Indian restaurant, but on top of that, you'll also have a dosa brand or something with a more limited menu and a totally different name. The thing that's interesting is sometimes, or often, I think most of the times, the original restaurant is not really advertised very much in conjunction with that virtual brand,
Yeah,
right? And I this is, I think, going to be one of the big trends we'll see for a few years now. I mean, if you're a chain, you could, in theory, create multiple virtual brands, or you could maybe get to a point where you have a monthly pop-up brand that's, instead of LTOs for menu items, you could have LTOs for brands, and just try something new each time, whether your master brand is communicated or not. So we're going to have some challenges about, do these count as restaurants? So when we say there's 670,000 restaurants, are these in that number? I don't know. I think we're going to have to figure that out as this grows, but I would be shocked if we didn't see an explosion in virtual brand activity over the next few years. This is the new LTO in a way, right? What are these new brands that we could create?
totally. And the cool thing is you can absolutely experiment. The way that these things get spun up and spun down is very it's very easy. What I also think is really interesting, this was the original premise behind delivery, and why delivery has been able to grow the way it has, is that most restaurants, especially those with a real front of house, the capacity constraint was in the front of the house. So whether that be tables and seats or a line and a queue out the door, that was the way you knew that your restaurant was doing as much business as it possibly could. Very few operators would say that the kitchen was at capacity, and that's why revenue had topped out. And so if you're in the circumstance as an operator where you're not saying that my kitchen is the problem, is where I've totally tapped out, then the downside to launching a virtual brand is relatively low.
Yeah, if you're a chain or even independent, I don't know why you wouldn't consider doing a virtual brand. It seems like it's all incremental.
Yeah.
We're running out of time and we're at the end, so I'm gonna sort of cut things short. Yes, drones are coming one day. We promise they're coming, and Dana's signing off on that too, because she's from that field. So look for them one day. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks. It's going to be fantastic. We're bringing back Dr. Paul Rosen, who is absolutely brilliant. He is the preeminent expert on food psychology, and he's going to be giving a wonderful talk on the psychology of meat, which will be incredibly fascinating. And just as a background, here's one observation that we love about Dr. Rosen, quoted by Daniel Kahneman. He's an expert on this. He's expert on the topic we discussed, and he found that a single cockroach will completely wreck the appeal of a bowl of cherries, but a cherry will do almost nothing at all for a bowl of cockroaches. So if you want to learn something fascinating in this vein, join us in 2 weeks. I'm so sorry we went over. There is so much more to cover, and I'm sure we'll keep it coming in the weeks ahead. But thank you all again for giving us your time today. And Dana, thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you on board.
Thanks, Jack.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.